Now let's start with user registration. Of course, this is a system where we want to manage users and have them log into the system. So let's start with the very basic part, which is user registration. And to do that, I'm going to start with the model by customizing the fields that come in the user model. So when you install Laravel, it does come with some fields for the user model, but I want to change them and have more data in the user model. So the first thing is I want to change the name and have a first name and last name. I want to add a username. I want to add some about information. So assuming that users are going to be authors creating courses, we want to get some information about them. So let's just add an about and we'll leave those three fields like that. Now let's go to the model that comes with Laravel. Again, when it is installed, we do have a user model that comes by default, and we need to customize that model to reflect the fields that we just added. So instead of name, I'm just going to say first name, last name, the username, and we want the username to be unique, and we are going to leave the rest as is. So let's just run this migration. So PHP artisan migrate. I'm going to do a fresh migration just to load things from scratch. And if we head over to our database, refresh this, we should now see that we have our users table with the first name, last name, and whatever fields we've added to that model. So things are looking good so far. The next thing is to create the controller and the route that will handle user registration. So let's start with the controller. So PHP artisan make controller, and I'm going to put all the authentication related controllers in an auth folder. So I'm just going to call this register user controller. Let's open that controller and see what we need to do in there. In the controller, we just need one method. So public function. And because I want this controller to only be responsible for registering the user and no other method in here, I'm just going to use the invoke magic function. And here we can pass the form request that comes from the user, or whatever request is coming from the user, and we call that request. Again, we are going to be translating this to data transfer objects later on, but let's go gently and start with a regular request to see how the data comes in and what we do with it. And when this comes in, let's just quickly do what we would do in a regular Laravel project. So request, validate, and this is where we would put our validation for the request. So we can call it validated equals request validate. And this is where we expect to see all the validation required for the for user registration. So we said we need the first name, and for the first name we want it required. You can add more validation rules if you want, but I'll just keep it simple here. For last name, we also want it required. For username, we want it required, but we also want it to be unique on the users table. For email, we want it required. It should be unique on the users table, and it should be an email. So actually, I'll just say required, email, and unique. We need a password. So when the user registers, we want to get a password, and that is going to be required. We want it to be confirmed. So we need a password confirmation field. And Laravel comes with some default password validation rules under a class called password. So we want to get the default, and we are going to show, I'm going to show you how you customize that in a minute. But let's just call the defaults class or the default method. And if I click and go into that class, you see that it does have some properties in there, whether the password should have mixed cases, which means it must have upper cases and lower cases to combine. You cannot only have upper cases or lower cases. It must have letters, it must have numbers. So you can basically call these different methods to customize how you want your passwords to look like. And if you want them to be extremely difficult, then you can customize that and make those and make your passwords more complex, or require the user to provide more complex passwords. So to customize your passwords functionality here, or the validation rules, we can do that in the service provider. So in the app service provider, under the boot method, we can simply call that password class and provide the customized version of the rules. So if we just go here, we can just say password, which is the rules, not the facade. And we define what we want the default to be. And this takes a function, which we'll just use our arrow function here in PHP. And we say password. The minimum should be 8 characters. We want the passwords to be mixed case. Mixed case meaning that we require users to provide both uppercase and lowercase, and we want it to be uncompromised. Laravel basically checks to see if the password is in a list of commonly compromised passwords online, right? So it should be uncompromised. Again, if you can go to the class here, you'll see all the different things that you can provide. So if you want to include symbols, that the password must include symbols, you can just add that and turn it to true. We already set the uncompromised to true. It was false by default. So there's a lot of different properties that you can add here. You can use from here to make your passwords even more difficult to hack. But for now, let's just keep that. I think it illustrates the point. Let's just keep that as the validation rule for our passwords. And that is what we are calling here. So whatever rules that we provide here will be appended to the defaults that we have set in our app service provider. So at this point, let's just die and dump, or let's just return the validated data actually. Now, we need, of course, for every controller method, we need a route that the user will then be able to hit that route to access the controller method. So let's go to our routes file, look at what we have, and all the routes are going to be in our api.php routes file because, well, we are developing an API. I'm going to clear everything that we have in the routes file for now. And let's start from scratch. So in the API routes file, I'm just going to create a section here that holds all our authenticated routes. Again, this is nothing that you need to do, but I just like to organize things in a way that I can easily remember what I was doing later on. So let's put our authenticated routes here. So, and here I'm just going to say route group. The prefix will be auth, and prefix means that every route that I define in here will start with auth and then slash whatever else I provide in the route itself. So the prefix will be auth, and then we wrap that in a function, which is a regular route in Laravel. And all our authenticated routes will be put in this group. So login, logout, user email verification, they will all be in this route or in this route group. So in this group, let's just add a route for registration, and we'll call that post, and that will be register. This is going to be in the register user controller. And we want to use the invoke method that we just created. Be sure to have that controller imported at the top because we are calling that class directly from here. And with this is pretty much ready for us to do an initial test to see if our API is working and if the routes are set up correctly. So to test our API, I'm going to be using Postman. You can use anything you want. You can use Insomnia. You can even use a VS Code plugin for it. But I'm going to be using Postman to test the API. I've kind of structured my Postman environment here to reflect the different routes that I will be creating throughout the project. And this makes it just easy for me to manage things. Now, the way Postman works is you can create environments that hold variables. And in this case, I've created an environment for this project, and the environment is called skill meter environment. And in here, I have specified a base URL because I just want to be able to type that and then append whatever URL I want to the request. So I shouldn't have to type this base URL every single time I'm making a request in Postman. I'll simply call that variable. I'm also setting one for token, which we will be looking at when we start doing authentication. But for now, just ignore that variable. So here in Postman, I have a register route, which we've already written in the back end. And we said it's pointing to the auth register endpoint. Because we are using a variable for the base URL, we have that pre-populated and you can see what the value is. Make sure if you are using Postman, make sure that you have your environment set to skill meter or whatever the environment is that you created for this. Now under the body, we have to send in some data that we send to the backend. So here I've simply created the request to match what we expect to get in the backend. In fact, let's assume that we didn't send a username, and let's get rid of the username just to see that our validation is working. And we can also just remove the password because we did customize how we want our passwords to work, the complexity of the passwords. If I try and send this request, let's see what happens. It says unprocessable entity, which is what we expect because that is a validation error. And if we look at what the error is, we says there's no username provided. So the username is required, which means we need to provide a username in here, and I'll just call that mjin. We also see that the given password has appeared in a data leak. So this password is not good enough. It has been flagged as a password that has been compromised. And so we need to provide something different. So if I did not include, if I just said password with all lower cases, we should also get a warning or an error saying the password field must contain at least one uppercase and one lowercase. And that is thanks to the password. If I just go to the app service provider, it's thanks to this mixed case property or function that we called on our password to make sure that users always provide both uppercase and lowercase in their passwords. So our validation seems to be working just fine. And if we fix that, I'm just going to say, this is my password 123. So depending on the complexity that you want to give your password, that is what you get, okay? So if I send that through, that password is accepted. And we are just sending back the request to the front end. We are not doing anything with the data, but at least at this point, the data has been validated. It is correct, and we can proceed to saving it to the database. So the next thing I want to do is come back and let's extract all of this into a data transfer object instead of just using the regular request that comes with Laravel. And we'll talk about that in the next lesson.